when AI started writing really cleanly, there was this moment where it's like, I've spent my whole life writing. Have I just, like, has that value just become a total commodity? And what I ultimately realized was, well, writing in a lot of ways became a commodity a long time ago. You think about like, journalism and, our friends on the games media side are constantly under attack, seeing their salaries and their opportunities diminished, right? And so, yes, there is an element of what AI is doing is just making that worse. But ultimately, it goes back to what you were saying, which is an AI cannot replace a human to human relationship. An AI cannot replace intuition. It cannot replace empathy. And it cannot replace these things that are ultimately what drive the strategy and drive the decision making for a game studio or a game publisher.
I think we could start with like a good intro about like who you are, what you do, like what's your current role, because I think it just helps the audience like figure out right away like who is Bob.
Oh, yeah. Well, Bob Holtzman, I am the franchise marketing director at ArenaNet for the Guild Wars franchise. Been in the video game industry since the 2000s. I think I'm on my 19th year. So it's weird because I actually started my career in journalism as a sports writer. And so there was this point where, I crossed over and it was like, oh, I've been in games more than sports journalism. And now it's like well beyond that, right? Like that was like this thing I did earlier in my career. I've worked at a variety of studios. I worked with Tencent's TiMi Studio Group. I worked with Riot Games. I worked with Nexon. I worked with a strategy studio called Nival. And I've also, worked in agencies and for myself. I ran a small consultancy that was, really sort of tying together community and PR and communications for live service games.
Very cool. What's the overlap between sports and games? Like having started in sports, I'm sure you're quite passionate of it, and you went into games. How was that transition, and how do you look back on it?
Well, I love video games. I've played them my whole life, but I'm not the typical like gamer. I play sports games and I play a lot of multiplayer games. I tend to not play the longer single player titles that, so many people in our industry like love. So like some of the AAA games, like, I'll play for a few hours and then sort of, peace out. And, sports, I used to play basketball. I still play golf. My wife's getting me to play pickleball. And ultimately, I think there's two components that really tie these two hobbies or passions together. The first is passion, right? Like, um, people care so much, right? They care about games. They care about, these services or products the same way they care about their soccer clubs or their, American football teams or basketball teams. And so there's a fanship and a passion around that I think binds them together in their own unique ways. They're very different. And then I think the second part is there's this sort of drive. If you're an athlete or you're a gamer, there is this real drive to get better, right? Get good, as they used to say in esports vernacular. I'm constantly trying to improve my golf game, but also, when I'm playing like CFB 27 right now, like I want to run, an RPO more effectively. Or if you're playing an RPG, you want to run the best build, right? The min maxing and all that stuff. So, you know, passion and this like kind of endless uh, quest to improve, I think really tie the two together.
Yeah, I love the idea of just been maxing being both sports and games. Like I can definitely see it. When you look at like someone trying to get better at League of Legends, they're focusing on like a specific role. Like if I'm playing basketball, I'm gonna be a point guard. I'm gonna focus on my passing. I'm gonna focus on my vision, on my handles, and it's like same thing if you're playing like a specific role in Overwatch or League of Legends. But yeah, I think the introduction is really great. Like it makes total sense. But when we think about like you working across journalism, consulting, franchise marketing, how do all these different experiences kind of shape the way you approach communication, right? Because from a surface level, communication is just communicating to players, but what does that really mean when it comes to doing that?
Well, I think the number one thing to remember is as humans, storytelling is is just like a part of us. We all want to tell stories. We want to hear stories. We want to embrace them. And whether you're a journalist or I'm working with a startup and trying to help them think about, how to raise money, earn PR, build a community, or, with a great franchise, like I'm working on these days with Guild Wars, you're ultimately building these stories that become a part of the community, that become part of the passion we just talked about, right? And so, whatever it is, there has to be story at the core.
Hmm. So, with your journalism background, how do you kind of think about like clarity and communication with the clarity and accuracy that comes with communications, right? Because if I have to write like let's say for Guild Wars, I have to write a communications to players, like maybe like a patch note, or I need to let them know about a specific situation that happened in game. Like I've seen it working at old school RuneScape. It's really cool to be able to see like all the CMs and the comms team working towards drafting a specific piece of comms for players. How do you approach it?
Well, I feel really fortunate that I started in journalism because it forces you to think about the world in a very simple framework. And it is who, what, where, when, why, how, right? Like, and it's just going back and sort of filling in the blanks on each of those questions. And when you start to think about what you need to do from a games comms perspective, it's not that different, right? Like ultimately, uh, you do get the advantage of some shared language, right? You talked about patch notes, so there's a certain amount of shared language that you get to have with the community. But they really want to know, what are you changing? Like, who is it going to affect? When is this happening? How is it happening? Where is this going to impact me, and why are you doing it, right? And so as you work through with the developer, with the community manager, with the PR team, whoever it is that you're working with, it's really about making sure that you're establishing these core facts and then figuring out the best way to communicate them to an audience. And so, uh, you know, at the end of the day, for me, I just need to kind of fall back on that. And if we are answering those questions, then I know the communication, at least at a baseline, is going to be reasonably taken well by a community member or player, right? And if I don't have those questions answered, if I can't really dig in and get those things nailed down, that's where the hard work comes in, right? And that's where you really have to work with your team and, have a little bit of patience because, sometimes this stuff for a communicator is just very straightforward. But sometimes you don't always have, a dev's like, well, why did I do that? Because that was the most expedient way to get there. And it's like, but that's not going to answer the player for a question. We got to go a little bit deeper. And so, having a little bit of patience, kind of relying on that background really does enable, I think, an opportunity to have a good engagement with players.
So communication, like if you were to go back into like early 2000s, it wasn't, I don't know, I'm speculating here. Tell me how it's kind of evolved through games, right? Because nowadays communication is essential because players are really well connected. They're online. They have all these different communities like Reddit, Discord, etc. But how did you kind of see the evolution of communication, like from like the start of your career to like today, and how has the importance kind of evolved?
There's a few ways that I've seen it, and I think the one that I want to flag the most is that early on, community management was a little bit more of, hey, go tell them this, just to get them to kind of stop, right? Like, just to stop whatever they're talking about or whatever they're spinning their wheels on. And today it's much more strategic, right? It's a part of a live service product's offering. It's everything is a little bit more considered and measured. And, it's with the intention of sort of, relaying a message that will satisfy the needs of the players. Whereas sometimes I think early on we were a little bit more, well, we need to tell them something. So let's just like kind of get it out there. Um, I think there's also a little bit more honesty. I think sometimes early in my career there was a lack of transparency and honesty, and so I think about um, there was this one message that we had to give to a community, and I won't name names, but it was very early in my career, and the CEO like um, was going to put their name on it, but it was a highly negative message. And so I think, ultimately some people were like, well, yeah, the buck stops here with the CEO. And other people were like, no, don't make the CEO carry the bad message. And today, I think game directors, studio heads are much more understanding of, how to build a message that may be taken poorly. Like we really struggled with this message. I still remember like 4 or 5 people were asked to draft. And ultimately whatever was sort of Frankenstein together wasn't very good and probably didn't satisfy players' expectations and created more negative sentiment than positive. And so, I think that's where we really see an evolution, just to sort of like, highlight is strategy and really understanding like what's your goal. And generally speaking, your goal is to neutralize negative sentiment.
And kind of communication in live service games always feels like a bit of a newsroom. Like it's very exciting, but like obviously you have like you have a population of people that are waiting to hear what you're going to say, and then there's always like I don't want to like a scramble, or it can either be very smooth or it's a bit of a scramble, it's a bit of a panic. Kind of how do you see like good communications in live service games? Because like I think we got like in this channel we got a lot of World of Warcraft players, got a lot of Guild Wars players, people that love playing Final Fantasy. Like MMOs in general is like a lot of where my audience is. So, what makes good live service communications?
So I actually, this was a question you had asked me before. And so it was funny because I was like, oh, I have an answer for this. And I actually wrote a framework. It was very simple, but I wrote a framework out back in 2020 when I was consulting. Because I was getting asked this question a lot, and I wanted to have a framework to sort of lean on when I was having these conversations with startups, with indie devs, and sometimes bigger live service teams, right? And so I have a 5 point framework for what I think you need to deliver good comms in live services. The first is you need to be fluid, right? Like there needs to be some semblance of like comfort moving. You need to be transparent. This probably should be number one, but I say fluid first because I do think that's the most important thing because these these games are ever changing. Our audiences are ever changing, so you need to sort of roll with them. You need to flow with them. But then if you're not transparent, it's going to come across as rigid, right? So you need to have that transparency. One thing that like for me, I'm a words guy. Like I said, I worked at a newspaper earlier in my career. You need to be visual, right? Like this was like one of the first things I learned working in PR was I was pitching a story to the Associated Press and I didn't give them any visuals. So we had these great quotes in the story, but the pictures were of other games. And it was like this sort of like, oh, Bob, you really dropped the ball here, right? And so when I sat down, many, many years later, more than a decade later, I go, well, what does it look like? This was like, well, it's got to be visual, right? Um, there needs to be a consistency. You can't just like talk to players, once a year and, you know, this is not like talking to an analyst or an investor, right? Like where you can do your annual investor letter. I think it's Ilka at Supercell writes one of the best letters every year, right? But he writes one a year. Well, if you're talking to players, you need to talk to them more than once a year, right? So there needs to be a consistency with that. But I will say this, Ilka is consistent. He does it once a year. I read it every year. Um, and then I think most importantly, you can't forget the emotional component. You need to be empathic. There needs to be empathy for your players. It's really easy for all of us to get into the us versus them mentality. Oh, these players, they're being mean or they're not nice or I remember we used the word toxic, earlier in my career a lot, and I think we've gotten away from that, where it's like, hey, we really shouldn't call the people who are buttering our bread toxic, right? And so you need to be empathetic, and if you do those 5 things, what you're ultimately going to accomplish is a level of trust building. And if you have trust with your audience, that means that you are going to be validated, right? There's going to be a level of validation where they will trust what you say. They will take it to heart. That's really important because you're going to make mistakes. In a live service environment, it's impossible not to make mistakes. Um, and so when you make them, if you have trust, people are more open to forgive you. If you're constantly doing bad things to your community and then you're trying to talk them out of being mad at you, like that's not going to work, right? But if you're constantly doing good by your community, you're doing right, and then you need to own a mistake, though there's some trust there, and they're going to go, well, hey, they messed this up, it's okay, right? And then this is the marketing component that's really important, and I always really wanted to sort of flag this, especially for the people who are always looking for virality. If you have trust, that promotes word of mouth. Without trust, people are not going to give you positive word of mouth. They're going to be like, yeah, we can't trust them, right? And so if you build off this framework, you do things consistently with transparency, you have some visual nature to your communications, you're fluid and you're empathetic, you start to build this trust. So whether you're nailing it and you're 9 out of 10 and you're that 1 out of 10 times suddenly doesn't make as big of a deal, right? But if you're going 2 out of 10 and 3 or 4 of those misses are like really untrustworthy, that's where you really get into trouble.
Yeah, the consistency part, I think, is for me. If I had to pick one, that's the most important. Like, if you kind of do a bit of communication, then you disappear, and then players are just always there, like waiting in this vacuum. That's never ideal. Um, I guess the next part I want to get into is you obviously have to work with developers. Like, you have to work with people on the team to figure out like what to communicate. And I think a lot of games. I'd be curious to hear if there are games that, or there are failures when there isn't this cross functional or yeah, cross functional relationship between kind of different teams. Because the cool thing about gaming again is that you have so many different types of people working together to deliver an output. And I think when it comes to comms, like if you want to inform players, you need to speak to art, you need to speak to devs, you need to speak to leadership. Like there's just this whole idea that you really need to talk to people. So how does that work when you're working in an organization like the ones that you have?
Well, some of it's really simple, right? It's like almost cliche, like, hey, be a good listener, right? Ask good questions. um, y- y- those are like very simple fundamental things. But one of the things that I've also understood is, um, there needs to be, like, back to empathy. You need to be empathetic towards the dev. The devs have different pressures, different expectations. They see the world very differently than a marketer, right? Like the whole nature of their job is different. And so there is a level of like being able to know that this person is going to have a very different viewpoint and being okay with that. And sometimes that's really hard because, I don't want to say you get rigid, but you get into a belief that you have a clear vision. And when somebody says, well, that's not so clear, as a communicator and as a marketer, that can be really tough because you're like you're driving towards goals and you're driving towards these like specific objectives and key results. And so suddenly now you have a dev partner who's like, well, actually, this is how we see things. And so this is one of the most sort of challenging aspects of the job because you know games are not made, typically speaking, live service games are not made by small teams. So they're very comfortable with doing things in a very more collaborative effort. Whereas, marketing teams tend to be a little bit smaller. The ones that, really want to move and sprint are trying to keep things lean, fewer approval loops. A lot of that stuff's done up front. So that way the teams can kind of run in their day to day. And now here you are going to a dev who's going to want a much deeper back and forth than maybe what you're used to on the publishing and the marketing side.
Yeah. No, no, no. That really does make sense. Um, I mean, with live service games, one thing to me is that so much of it is dominated by long-term players, so like people who really stick around. I mean, I can think of all the MMOs, like the ones that are really going to read your messages are the ones that are loyal to the game, want to know what's happening, they're keeping up with the various different communities. So, what type of responsibility do you have when it comes to communicating specifically with those long-term players? Because like short-term players may be there for the ride, they may be there for a patch, or maybe they're just trying it out, but it's not really a given that they're going to read the comms. It's probably the long-term players that are the ones that are really invested.
I mean, this might be the most important part of, a comms team's job, whether it's community management or a player relations team or, whatever you're sort of calling it, because this is your audience. They have high expectations. You know, the trust levels are sort of like a stock, right? They're going up and down on a daily basis based on your last comms, based on your last patch. And so suddenly, you have this deep responsibility to them. And when you miss, they know you missed. And so, one of the things that you really have to set the table with is you have to build internal alignment with your teams before you even get to that moment where you're putting a message in front of them at a public level. Um, you know, and good teams have ways to talk to them before they finalize something, right? There's an internal conversation with some of maybe their most passionate players, and there's play testing. I always think about how Riot has the public beta environment, PBE, right? Like what a what a powerful way to communicate with your players in advance of something going live, right? Like we have this whole test environment where we're going to run everything by you as a player, and then once we see that it works, we're going to patch it into the official game. And so stuff like that really matters. And one of the things I will say I've always known, but I really appreciate in my current role at ArenaNet is when publishing, marketing, publishing community, whatever part of your publishing org and your dev org are really working in unison to make moments happen for players. Because now suddenly you're sort of firing all cylinders. And it's not easy. I've worked at places where it's really hard to achieve that. And I think anytime a team can do that, that is going to also sort of, back to your initial question, when you can do that, then it becomes more than just, oh, I have this message, right? It's like I have this moment to share with the community. And your long term players will deeply appreciate that.
How was you mentioned Riot? Like how what was it like with kind of Riot has this position where they have these public test servers? Were they kind of innovating when it came to transparency and like communicating with players early and creating those avenues? Like what was Riot's kind of unique value?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of public information about this, so I think there's a few things I can share that are I'm just reinforcing. And the first is, when you think about the founders of Riot, Mark Merrill, Brandon Beck, they really recognized something that, now we sort of take for granted, which is, hey, we just want to keep playing the same game and we want to see it improve, right? And that relationship with your play that changes your relationship with your players so much, and it's changed our industry so much, right? Because now you're sort of on this journey with your player that goes long beyond launch day, right? Like one of the things we always talk about in live service is launch day is just the beginning. And if you're in a free to play game, launch day is not your most important day, right? It's just one important day on a road where you hope you have many, many important days. So, I think there's that component. I think to your question, Ilya Rotelli, who was, one of the hiring managers that brought me to Riot and was really innovative when it came to community management and community engagement. He was very, very adamant that you have to give players the reason why. You have to answer why. And I think Riot did that better than anybody for a long time. And I don't know, have the rest of us caught up with Riot? I don't know. I'll leave that for somebody else to answer. But I do think they definitely sort of were innovative in that aspect. And one of the reasons I got to work at Riot, to talk a little bit about my background, was I worked on an indie game called Kerbal Space Program. And Kerbal was very much cut out of the swath that Minecraft was, which was, hey, we're going to sell you this early access game, but we're going to improve it. And we're going to raise the price every time we make an update because it's getting better. And so if you join now and you buy it today, you're going to get a better price than somebody will in 6 months or a year, right? And there were ways where we manipulated that. We do discounts and stuff, but this was a really powerful approach to development because now you have this small team that was building this game in unison with their community. And one of the things that I recognized, I ended up doing a GDC talk about this, was that you might own the game, but the community owns you, right? Like the community is really the one driving this machine now. And I think Riot on live service really understood this. I think we really got to understand it on an indie level with Kerbal, building with the community. To that point, I worked with modders who became part of the Kerbal dev team. They were originally modding the game. Felipe Falange, the guy who created Kerbal Space Program, was like looking at these mods, going, "These are awesome," and would end up like bringing some of these these players onto the team, and some of them, are still working in the games industry today. And so, yes, Riot was innovative, um, but I think there was this maturing of community management, of community engagement that was happening at multiple levels across the industry. And, I think, they were really ahead of the game when you think about free to play live service. But there were also other people that were sort of learning this and leveling up our whole industry.
Yeah, I love how like a lot of World of Warcraft players they love looking back at the blue posts or on the forums, right? And it's one of those things that like, oh, how do you capture that genuine kind of approach, right? Because in a lot of games you might just see like a Reddit post and it'll have like the usual graphic and there's like a scroll and a lot of text and everyone's like, but a lot of players romanticize, and I don't mean that like disparagingly, but like they kind of they love this idea of like one-to-one direct communication between like a dev and the player, as if they were kind of sitting right next to them. It's that I think that genuinity, which is just so sought after in games, and I guess what I want to ask is, you want to don't you as like a comms person want to be careful of over standardizing how you communicate to players, because maybe players just want to feel close to the dev team. They want to feel like it's genuine, not like it's just like the old template and the old, like, I don't know, like I've seen so many MMOs that say, "We hear you." Like every time there's a problem, it's like, "We hear you." And I'm just, I'm thinking, like it's so powerful when like a dev like puts their face out there and just be like, "Hey, like this is the problem we had. This is how we're solving it. This is the behind the scenes." I always felt that was such a powerful combination, but obviously it's not as easy to do always. I just wanted to get your thoughts on like making genuine communication and bringing back that blue post feel that like WoW players have.
Well, it's funny. There were red posts at Riot, and I,
There we
I
go.
forget what we call them at ArenaNet right now. I'm blanking, but this is one of the great challenges I think of the games industries when they're sort of giving customer service that isn't like true CS, right? It's like this is an area that a lot of other industries don't have a one-to-one, right? Like Coca-Cola doesn't have to worry about having a deep engaged discussion about the design of their can for their next special edition Coke Zero, right?
Yeah.
um so and movies do a little bit, but could you imagine if like the director of Spider-Man was like on Reddit you know for months on end? I don't know that it would work, right? But gaming, because of live service and the evolution of the games, and we're constantly adding new content, and it's this this constantly changing environment, you get this. Um, so I'm a big believer in dev to player engagement. I think it really matters. I think it impacts how people feel about the product. I think if you go back to the framework that I mentioned earlier, it hits on all those things, right? Besides maybe visual, but then I do think the visual aspect is like you said, like, oh my gosh, this developer responded to me. I can
Yeah.
see it on my screen, right? Like that. Sometimes that's all the visual you need. There's empathy, consistency, transparency there, and fluidity, right? Because you don't know where they're going to respond to. But I'll also say that one of the things I've seen is it can be really taxing on a dev team because you know that's not their full-time job, right? Like their full-time job is actually to design, develop, engineer, program a game, and so it's a it's a real challenge to sort of manage those two sort of things almost on like a scale, right? Because it's like, well, if I take them away from their day to day, that could actually be more impactful than this message. And so it's not something that is an easy answer. And I've worked on teams where we've sort of templatized it, like that aspect of it, like, hey, we're going to get together at a certain time and we're going to work on it in this manner. And I think that's very effective. I will say I'm a big believer in what we've kind of called the buddy system, where you're going to go engage. That's amazing. Have a friend, have somebody that can sort of like read what you post before you post it to make sure you're not like, maybe posting too irrationally or emotionally, and, you know, sort of smooth any rough edges. So, you know, ultimately, I guess what I would say to you is no matter where you're communicating, you do need to this is a business, right? Like there still needs to be a certain level of professionalism, but where it sings and where the magic happens is when you can balance your professionalism with your craft as a writer, as a passionate game maker, and you can kind of bring those two together. And then that's where players, I think, find the most value.
Yeah, that's where I had a blast when I would communicate to players was just I think again, like you said, like showing the empathy for the problem and acknowledging it. I think one thing that we spoke about offline was this idea that you can't be reactive to problems. So like I mean I can speak from personal experience, just empathizing with the fact that hey, we know it sucks. We're trying to sort it out. These are the things that are stopping us. And just I found that the more honest you are with players about the situation, of course, to the extent that you can be, because not everything needs to be communicated. But if you can try to be more honest as honest as possible, players love that and they feel part of the equation. And I guess what I want to ask you is like I see a lot of not a lot, but I've seen examples of other games that maybe are more reactive to certain things. And how do you draw the line between like listening to community and being reactive to one instead?
Well, I know you would use like kind of the funny example of we hear you, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, listening is an acknowledgement, right? It's acknowledging that you've heard their side of the coin. There's you've heard what's happening on their side of the fence. Um, Reacting is there's a proper way to react, and that is through a responsible sort of strike team moment where people are working together and you're really evaluating it, and you're crafting a response, right? And then there's like the more damaging reaction, which is you get defensive and you you might be listening, but you're not hearing the player, you're not hearing the other side, and that can be really problematic for a few reasons. The first is the minute you're defensive, you've kind of lost the battle, right? And this is communications for video games, for relationships in the real world, for your job, right? Like if you've ever had a boss that asks you a question and your initial response is, well, they said to do that, like you've kind of already lost, right? It's really no different when you're talking to a community, right? And so ultimately, some of this is sort of, almost like a psychology meets comms situation. Um, and players, that again, players are so emotional about this, Ali, right? Like they're so emotional that because of the passion, that the minute you get defensive, you are reacting from an emotional point. And so what happens when you feed emotion to somebody else who's already emotional? You're just going to get more emotion back. And
Yeah.
so, like you're never going to win a fight with your community.
No, it's going to steamroll. I mean, everyone's going to start commenting and everything's going to start adding up, and it gets impossible to control the narrative. And I don't think even at that point you can. And I think one of the great things about kind of communities like Reddit or even Discord is that like everyone gets heard, but you do have the crowd mechanics or just the crowd theory, which is like as soon as everyone joins a mob pile, uh, you're not stopping it. So yeah, it's an interesting point. I just think that one thing I wanted to just highlight of what you said is so much of communications is kind of balancing just how you would speak to someone, like being genuine, the way you say something, and not sounding cliche, not sounding dismissive. Like it's hard to write actual theory about this because in a lot of ways it's intuition. It's how you write a message. Like the best comms and PR people just they can feel a message. They can feel like how the other person is going to feel in their shoes, and that to me is it makes it such an interesting discipline because it's like there is no science. Like a developer knows you write code this way, you get this output. Writing stuff is like, yeah, how does the community react to it specifically? It's not, you can't calculate it perfectly.
Well, and it's, I've been thinking a lot about, obviously I think we all are thinking a lot about AI and its effects on how we work and what we do and where work is going. And, when AI started writing really cleanly, there was this moment where it's like, I've spent my whole life writing. Have I just, like, has that value just become a total commodity? And what I ultimately realized was, well, writing in a lot of ways became a commodity a long time ago. You think about like, journalism and, like, our friends on the games media side are constantly under attack, for seeing their salaries and their opportunities diminished, right? And so, uh, yes, there is an element of what AI is doing is just making that worse. But ultimately, it goes back to what you were saying, which is an AI cannot replace a human to human relationship. An AI cannot replace intuition. It cannot replace empathy, and it cannot replace these things that are ultimately what drive the strategy and drive the decision making for a game studio or a game publisher.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, on the flip side, being genuine, like the way you write, having a unique writing style, having a unique tone is even more important because I think even before LLMs, people would just kind of copy like structures and the way they would say things like "we hear you." Like if one person sees that's like that's a great phrase, I'm gonna go use it in mine now. And like in a way, the industry kind of followed lockstep with certain like structures and ways of communicating. And I think LLMs have just pushed that to its extreme. So I think on the flip side, if like you actually know how to write genuinely and you have a specific communication style, and I don't know, it's not about just writing with no caps, but it's about like the tone, the way you speak. I wish I had a better way of communicating, but I kind of know when I'm speaking from, like when I'd communicate with players on Reddit, I had this way of which I'd speak to them. I'd say like much love, guys. I'd try to be like a little, not hip, but makes me sound so lame. But like I just try to feel like one of them. Like I try to have like the gamer talk, but of course I'm a developer, and of course when we talk about like specific technical things, I'll be specific and technical and professional. But I also wanted them to feel like I was one of them, and I think that's something that an AI you could instruct it to do it, but it's going to do it awfully. It doesn't know how to balance those things.
Well, one of my like one of the people I've gotten the chance to work with who I deeply respect, Ryan Rigney, who was a communicator at Riot and has worked on a bunch of other great games as well. he would go on Reddit, on the subreddit, the League of Legends subreddit, and he was kind of a meme king, right? Like you said, he could speak their language. He's a very funny person, right? And so he could bring that sense of humor, and and he was a passionate writer, and so he could sort of merge those two, and you can't duplicate that, right? And that's talent, right? And that is understanding the audience. So there's the talent of like, hey, I'm going to communicate this, but then there's also this like, hey, I actually understand who this audience is and what matters to them and why I can, you know, take a run at something that I think is pretty funny that may seem edgy to somebody else, right? And do it in a way where the community feels like, okay, like they're one of us.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Totally. It's a skill that you can acquire. Some people are intuitively very good at it. But it is something that I think if you do it right, I think no LLM will ever be able to completely copy it. For me, like I'm super interested to better understand because you've worked at such a high level, all the different layers of PR and comms that exists in game studios and kind of gaming corporations, right? Because you go from like the community manager on a games team to like maybe the team CM and then maybe there's the PR for exec and then there's the comms for kind of the corporation itself. Like what are the layers that you could describe to someone who's interested in understanding more?
Well, I mean, this is a good question. Uh, and every team's different, right? So, when I was at Tencent, it was pretty multi-layered across studios, across publishing teams, across like sort of like Tencent corporate. I mean, we're talking about one of the biggest companies in the world. So, they're
Yeah.
going to have their communication teams matrix in a variety of ways. Um, you know, I think when I was consulting and I was sort of thinking about what are the pieces a team would need, that you have sort of your marketing comms, which can be, both direct marketing, but also like your owned or shared channels. So you have your social media, you have your community management, which you touched on. You have public relations, which can be a variety of tactics. It can be, like how do you engage with your like real world business community? So, like for example, if you have a studio in ArenaNet's in Bellevue, Washington, how are you engaging with other businesses in Bellevue, right? Yeah, you have your media relations, you have your corporate communications, you also have, like you said, leadership. Um, at Riot, I worked on a team that was called player relations, and that was sort of like building content pieces with devs. So one of my favorite things I ever got to work on was we created this program called Ask Riot, and it ran for like I don't know, like 7 years. Long after I was not a part of it, it continued on, and it was this process where we allowed players to ask us questions and then we would answer them on a regular basis. Like, and there was like at one point we had this whole Zendesk back end. So you could ask a question in any language and then we could filter it and kind of go, okay, what are the questions we know we can answer? And what are the questions that are in demand? And so that was a whole other, component, right? So it really depends on your team. It really depends on your needs. It really depends on the leadership and the value they find. So like our team at ArenaNet, we have a PR person, we have brand managers who are thinking about communicating the brands for our different, our games, Guild Wars 1 or Guild Wars Reforged, Guild Wars 2, and, we announced Guild Wars 3. You have community management, you have content marketing, you have social media, and, one thing we haven't talked about yet is influencer relationships, right? And content creators.
I
And, that has become a huge part of your communications mix because these are incredibly influential people who can create more content than you can dream of really to do on your own. And
Yeah, they can
so
make or break a game.
they really can.
And I'm thinking immediately, like when our creators came out, like Peanut, like the streamer, literally carried that game in terms of its also fantastic game. I think now it's dropped a little bit, but I just thought it was an amazing game. And
Absolutely.
I just remember watching Peanut and just thinking like this guy is like doing like you can't pay for that level of marketing, for that level of content, and for the reach he was creating. It's like a complete hack for like any company to have such an influencer.
Great example. The one I always use because I think I have like 16, 1700 hours in PUBG on Steam is when Shroud was playing PUBG. I would watch
Mm.
Shroud. And, for me, it was okay, I love PUBG. I'm not that good. I can watch Shroud play, back to the sports analogy we started with. And it was sort of like watching Michael Jordan play basketball. It was like, oh, he plays this game completely differently than I'll ever play it, right? Like, you know, he could do the no scope headshots and just the complete mastery of everything and so quick and fluid and and he could talk while he was doing it. Like my teenage son will come in the room when I'm playing a video game and I'm like, no, 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 I'm not a streamer. I gotta focus. And so you have this world now where these people, whether it's Peanut, Shroud, there's so many, right? They not only can change an opinion on a game, they can build their own community within a game, right? And so there's a real need for studios to understand this, to embrace it. You think about where we were, when I started in the industry in 2007. People were still talking about DMCA's and, do we allow these people to play our games or not? There was a time where people thought they should pay us, right? I mean, that table's turned, right?
Oh yeah, I'd say significantly. I mean, I've had the opportunity and also just like the fortune of being able to speak to streamers on this podcast, and they are just a wealth of knowledge into the game. They really understand the game inside out. They're great advocates for it. Like one person I always go back to and reference is Zaryu. Like he's like when you watch him play World of Warcraft, like he has such a great understanding of the game. He really knows how to like create great content. Um, it's just you kind of see someone at his craft, like creating great content, balancing what players are saying. It's really impressive, and I think I don't want to be against the game companies, but I think sometimes they're taking a bit for granted how essential they are to the marketing, to like the growth of the game companies. And I guess the next question I have for you is like, what is the influencer strategy when it comes to kind of comms? Like, how do you manage these streamers? How do you find them? Like, how do you get them to play your game? Do they just kind of choose serendipitously and you just find out on Twitch? Like, well, what's the strategy there?
Well, I mean, every game is different. Every studio is different. I I think what I've seen work is is that you need to sort of think about it on multiple levels in multiple manners, right? Like you can't just be like, hey, I'm gonna spend $1 million and I'm gonna go get like these three big streamers to stream my game and I win, right? You can't do
Yeah,
that. We've seen
like
that
Ninja.
fail,
Yeah, Ninja with
right?
Microsoft. No, yeah,
Yeah, we've seen that fail. You can't just go for the small ones and hope that they kind of grow with your game because y- you know the, while they have captive audiences, they're really small, and so you know you need them. And in an ideal world, what sort of the dream for every studio and streamer is you sort of grow with them, but you can't assume that will happen, and you can't just go for that. And then you have your mid tier, which is like they're probably gonna cost you some money, to really get invested. They're gonna have a big enough audience that if their audience doesn't like your game, they're gonna probably either back out or peace out. And so you kind of got to do it on all three levels, right? Like you got to think about how do we attract the big folks at the right time. Um, and you have to use that very strategically because it's expensive. And while the games industry does make a lot of money, it's expensive to make games, right? So you have to be
Yeah.
thoughtful. It's no different than any other marketing campaign or marketing tactic. You really want to build that mid tier. And one thing I will say for well, what I've seen, what I think is really cool at ArenaNet is we have a partner program for Guild Wars, and it enables us to sort of have a strong relationship with you know anybody who applies and gets accepted in the program, right? So you can be big, medium, small, and you can kind of there's a certain element of work that is done by the team that I'm a part of, and we have an influencer relations person who's fantastic, and she works incredibly hard, and is really doing this balance, right? Thinking this through. And so, everybody's got to do it their own way. You're, based on your game, based on your audience, based on your reach. But if you just try to like go for broke in one way, you're probably gonna miss out.
Yeah, I love the parallel. Like my old my ex flatmate used to work at the NBA, and I met some of his colleagues, and they were like player relations colleagues, and it's kind of similar with sports. Like you have these like really influential individuals in your community, and like you have to not manage them, but you have to reach out to them, have a great relationship, see how things are going. Like it's it's such an interesting thing to see games also taking that with the influencers, and prop to the influencers because like they really do, like we said at the start, they can make or break your game, and they're not obligated to stream for you. I mean, unless they sign a contract, but they can always go find like whatever their audience. They're at the whims of their audience at the end of the day. Like if their audience get bored of your game, like Peanut's gonna go play something else, right? And yeah, Embark could like be like, oh, that's too bad, but like that's kind of how it works. They gotta look out for themselves, and it's all very kind of quid pro quo.
I like what you said about, that they need to also service their own community and their own audience. And that is one of the things that has become more recognizable, but also more challenging for a game studio that's, trying to work with a content creator, because ultimately there is, like I mentioned earlier, I did a talk at GDC, you own the game, but the community owns you. I mean, you can swap out game for stream with a streamer, right? You run the stream, but the community decides what you stream.
Yeah.
If your numbers go down on Twitch or on YouTube, you can't ignore that, because that's their living, right? And I do think, and we've touched on it a little bit, but we more on the communication side, but really there has become a much more apparent need, whether you're a streamer or a game maker or whoever, if you're in this ecosystem, you do have to really be listening to what your community's expectations are, and you need to be satisfying them, because it is so competitive and there are so many other options that if you fail to do that, they're just going to go play something else. They're just going to go watch something else. And this is really hard. You know, I worked with Min Kim, who is a co-founder for a studio now, but we worked together in Nexon. And one of his favorite sayings back in the early 2000s, early 2010s, was, we're in an all boats rising scenario. I don't know if that's true anymore, because it's gotten so much more competitive. It used to be, hey, if any free to play game is doing well, that's kind of good for free to play, because now, it just means more people are open to this sort of game environment. Same with live service. Well, as we've seen and we've talked, I think ad nauseum as an industry over the last 6 years, really since the 2020 started, is you've got these big entrenched superpowers in gaming, whether it's WoW, League, Valorant, CS:GO, PUBG, Fortnite,
Yeah.
now Roblox, right? And so these are the same games that people have been playing now, going on a decade plus. I mean, we benefit from that with Guild Wars, right? Like Guild Wars 2 will turn 15 in 2027, right? So, like, you know, we understand, whichever one of those games you work on, or a new game that I didn't mention, like it's hard to get people to move, but if they decide to move, they tend to move in groups because it means that something's happened where the group decides they don't want to play anymore. And so this is really important. And you know, it sometimes it can start with creators, right? Like, to bring this all back, it can start with creators.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the coolest things I ever saw was like the Great Migration when it was clear that the WoW devs weren't gonna add much of anything new to World of Warcraft, and so especially in Classic. And so all the classic WoW streamers just one day I went to work and all of a sudden all the WoW streamers are playing old school RuneScape. I remember just getting to the office like this is the coolest thing in the world. Like all of a sudden, like the game's doing great and you got this whole new audience that's checking out RuneScape. But on the other, it's like you get so much data now. Like now you can go into all the different streams and they're all trying the game for the first time. And I remember just like watching all their streams and like just like observing like how they do quests and how they do different pieces of content and what they would say and like what the channel, like what their live chat would be saying. And like as a product manager, as a dev, as anyone that's working in the games industry, like what a privilege to have a live community trying your game for the first time because you can learn so much from that interaction. And I hope it gets taken seriously, like across all games, because that's the power these streamers wield is just they can go into a game and they can create either a whole new generation of first time players or the complete opposite. They can get completely turned off by it and then they'll never try it.
I mean, I think it's a great point, and it also reminds me of something I've been thinking a lot lately, which is, you know, whether it's old school RuneScape, Guild Wars Reforged, Guild Wars 2, WoW, these games that have been around for a long time, it's still a new game to somebody. Like,
Yeah.
there's somebody out there that hasn't played these games and it's a new game. And, these are all really well-made games that now have, a decade, 2 decades worth of content. So while yes, that can be daunting for some new players, it can also be seen as an opportunity for others. And if you have a good creator relationship or a good creator program or just a good creator that can help people sort of see the opportunity there, it can be a game changer.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. I completely agree. It's such a privilege. It can also go the other way if you don't approach it correctly.
It can.
I would say, Bob, like, do you have any? I think you mentioned you had like a great story about Guild Wars, or was it another game like that we wanted to touch on if we get towards like the end of towards the end of this podcast?
Well, I think one thing that's happened recently is you and I had sort of dabbled around comms mix, right, and channels.
Yeah.
And so, one thing that just happened this summer was, so I joined ArenaNet not quite a year ago. So I don't know when you're going to publish this, but it'll be right around my year anniversary, give or take a
Oh,
week or
congrats.
two. Thanks. Yeah, it's been a great year. Really enjoying my time with ArenaNet, and it's a great team. I feel really lucky to be there. And I've been fortunate. I've worked with great teams, like throughout my career. And but this has been a really fun challenge. And obviously, announcing Guild Wars 3 earlier this summer was, a highlight, I think, for anybody that works in games industry to announce a game that has so much passion, and to be part of the team that did that was really cool.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to flag was, you asked a question, or you had brought up a question around channel mix. And, there's an old cliche that I love. Some of these cliches, they're good because they're true. And, there's the fish where the fish are, right? My son loves to fish. And so part of the challenge for him is he's got to go find the place where the fish are. Oh, there's a bunch of fish. All right, let's throw my reel there. Well, it's no different with these channels, right? And so one of the things that sort of like I didn't realize when I joined ArenaNet is we had not launched a Discord server. We were just, letting the community run their own. And we talked about it for several months. And ultimately we decided it was a good time to create our own. And it was really cool because we ended up making the Discord server announcements part of the build up to the Guild Wars 3 announcement. And so the week of Summer Game Fest, when we announced Guild Wars 3, we launched the server earlier in the week. And so it kind of gave the community this place to congregate while they knew we were going to be part of Summer Game Fest. So it was this very sort of like nice reciprocal opportunity for the community to be like, hey, they're going to do something. We don't know what, but it seems like we're going to be really excited. Um, and then, just I think last week we were able to share that we hit 50,000 members of the server, and so
Oh
we were
wow.
able to then like celebrate that with some cool concept art from Guild Wars 3 for the community to check out and enjoy. And so, you know, I think this is a great example of the fish where fish are. The channels change over time, and you do need to have a certain level of fluidity when you think about how you're going to do these things, because we still have a server, or excuse me, we still have a forum for Guild Wars 2, right? And we still have an active community on a classic online forum, and that's not going to go away. But as you think about where the modern games audience is, it's definitely on Discord. I use Discord almost every day. I probably do use it every day, to talk with friends, to follow some game communities. I follow sports communities too, actually. And so you can kind of, that's kind of the fun of Discord, right? Is it's actually in a lot of ways very old school, but it feels very modern,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we also forget that like 50,000 people in a Discord, that's like a stadium full of people. Like, sometimes we
right?
see these numbers, but we totally underestimate like how many people that is. And that like when you're like sending out a message, it's like standing in the middle of Madison Square Garden, just being like, hey,
Yeah,
what's up? This is what we're doing. And everyone's like, yeah, like it's such an unreal number that I think we just kind of get desensitized by like how many people are congregating in like one channel.
that's a great point. And it's important to remember scale, but also, I think you mentioned it earlier. The fun thing about Discord is that it can also feel very intimate, because
Yeah.
while maybe there's lots of people lurking, listening, passively watching, you can have like a real conversation there at the same time.
Bob, do you have, I think for anyone listening, do you have any advice for games teams, people that want to communicate? I know we obviously this whole podcast has been a wealth of advice, but what would you suggest to anyone that's trying to communicate better with their players, uh, and yeah, just wanna do better from someone that has like your 19-year experience?
Well, it's funny. I think you kind of gave the best advice earlier when we were talking about the framework, and you said consistency was the one that stood out most to you. And my advice is do it, period, consistently, period. Because
Yeah,
you know a friend of mine really likes LinkedIn, and kind of encouraged me to post more on LinkedIn. And the part that was the hardest to get used to was the consistency, right? And so that's just on a personal level, right? But when you get to something bigger and more of a collaborative effort, like communicating about your game, about your community to your community, that consistency is harder. There is more complexity there. It's not just okay, I'm going to sit down and type up 2, 3 posts today, right? It's I'm going to talk to this team. I'm going to talk to that team. I'm going to build a plan. I'm going to have a calendar. I'm going to have a strategy, right? Like all these pieces that you need to do to kind of build that consistency. But what happens is a players really like it. Even if they don't like what you're saying, they're going to really like that you're consistently engaged. Um, Two, you're going to get better at it, right? Like you're not going to just like constantly feel like, oh, I don't know what to say. It's like you said, you're gonna build that intuition, which was I think a great point that you made earlier. Um, and then three, it's gonna actually deepen your relationships within your own teams to the point where a time is gonna come where somebody's working on something, and because those relationships are stronger, because of this effort to communicate consistently with your community, that you will create something that is far better than what it would have been if you didn't have this consistent communication to
yeah.
to deliver to players.
Yeah, it's like just getting in the gym, right? You just put in the
Yeah.
practice and you'll get used to it. Last question for someone listening that wants to be a games journalist or work in communications and games, right? Someone that maybe is like a little discouraged by all this LLM stuff and thinking, oh, like how on earth? I feel like I'm really good at being a community manager, or I have potential, or just wants to get involved in the games industry. Just any advice for someone to maybe stick it out or to not be discouraged?
Hey boy, this is a hard question because it is really tough right now. And I feel for so many people in our industry who are, maybe looking for new work or trying to decide what to do with their career. And I've been there. I've had harder times in my career where, I've been trying to explore and do things. And, ultimately what I would say is be open-minded. You know, maybe the road that you expected to take to the games industry is not going to be as straightforward as you would hope. Um, I would say, be open-minded to, different pathways. I would say build relationships, right? That go beyond just like, transaction, that are about, really getting to know people and understanding who they are. Um, and I think, if this is what you're passionate about and you love games the way I know so many people in our industry do, um, you know, just, be humble because there is this industry is ever evolving. And, one of the things I've been saying for the last couple of years is right now it's bad, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be this way. Um, and, I think back to 2008, 2009, where we were kind of going through a recession in the US, and, free to play gaming ended up being a great place to be, right? But if you were in double A, not so good. It was not a good time to be in the industry. And so, right now live service is tougher unless you're working on, a very specific set of products. So I would just say, be humble, be patient. And I know it's a little, it's hard. It's hard. I, I don't have great advice for
It's
this one.
okay.
It's
I
tough.
think regardless, I think it's just acknowledging it and giving your 2 cents, which I think is always valuable in this day and age when there's just so much communication out there. But no, I think those are wise words, Bob. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I mean, we've been talking about this for a while, and I'm finally glad we got to do this. So I learned
Thanks for your
loads.
patience.
No, man, thank you for being patient as well. So thanks for joining.